This video is going to explain how to properly journal a short story. So before we get into our example and our model, I want to explain some things that you should do and some things that you definitely shouldn't do. So a bad entry is going to analyze what the author says. It's not as simple as pulling a quote from the story and then explaining the quote. Um, what you do want to do is analyze how the author says. Now, that's a little bit confusing until I show you the example, but keep that in mind. We're not focusing on what they say, we're focusing on how they say. A bad entry only looks at things like theme and plot. It's very surface level. It often ends up just restating what the quote has already told us. It may be tempting to discuss some of these important themes, but this is not the function of your journal. A discussion of those themes will come through by analyzing some of the things on the other side here, which say explains the effect of literary devices, explains the effect of the author's choices, focuses on things like syntax, verb tense, person, etc., and how those decisions affect the story and the reader. So, in other words, you will be able to discuss the theme of the story, but it's going to come through the analysis of the literary device and the author's choices. So, where do you begin? Step one, you're going to type out the quote that you want to discuss. So, as you're reading, a quote is going to stand out to you. You're going to have something to say about a particular sentence in the story, and you're going to type that out completely. Now, you can use part of a quote, just make sure you're using the ellipses to indicate that there's either more before or after the quote. That's fine. But make sure you give enough of the quote that it's easy for me to see when I grade it what it is that you're commenting on. Step two, within that quote, you're going to identify any use of imagery, diction, syntax, tone, or figurative language of any kind, which includes similes, metaphors, personification, onomatopoeia, alliteration, assonance, consonants, anaphora, synecdoche, metonymy, juxtaposition, ironies, symbols, motifs, and many, 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 many more. I just listed a few things that come up often in literature. You may know what a lot of those words are. There may be a couple there that you don't know, but that's what we're going to be spending the year doing is identifying some of the more complex literary terms. The last thing that you're going to do, step three, you're going beyond identifying those figurative devices, figurative language, and you're going to explain the effect of that figurative language on the story or the poem or whatever it is that you're analyzing, or explain the effect on the reader, which is you. And you're always going to refer to yourself in these journals as the reader. Okay, so what do I mean? I'm going to clarify that all now with our model, which is the short story, The Shawl. I'm hoping at this point you have all at least read The Shawl and maybe even taken a look at some of the annotations I made on my version of the story. It's my strong recommendation that when you journal, you print out a copy of the story or make a photocopy of the poem and make your annotations right on the story itself. So as we go through these examples here, it would be very beneficial if you had my annotated copy of The Shawl next to you. So I basically went paragraph by paragraph here in this presentation. I'm not going to waste the time of reading this whole first paragraph, but within this paragraph, the first paragraph of the story, I found several lines that I would like to comment on, several things that I think are entry worthy. So here we go. The first sentence of this story, Stella, cold, cold, the coldness of hell. The first thing I notice is the repetition there. The word cold is repeated 3 times. Okay, so I'm going to want to say something about that. Notice that all the words in purple, those are key words that I'm going to be looking for in your journals. Okay, so you see repetition, diction, juxtaposition, setting, and syntax. Those are all figurative language, figurative devices that we're going to want to be commenting on throughout the journal. So let's read this first entry together. The repetition of the word cold 3 times serves to emphasize the conditions of the concentration camp. Coldness is not just one aspect of the setting, it is the overwhelming aspect of the setting that the author wants the reader to focus on. In addition, cold is a clever choice in diction because it's describing both the atmosphere as well as Stella's personality. The author could have used a word like frigid or wintry, but it would have been less effective. Cold is able to convey the author's dual purpose. The juxtaposition found within the phrase coldness of hell is interesting and captures the essence of the concentration camps. These seemingly contradictory ideas actually make perfect sense. Though hell is typically imagined to be filled with fire and brimstone, hell, for these characters, is real. Not only is the temperature they endure freezing, but the hearts of the Nazis can be described as cold as well. The setting is a place that can be described as a type of hell on earth that is uncharacteristically cold in both temperature and its attitude towards humanity. Lastly, it is worth noting the unique syntax of this sentence, which is actually a fragment. The author begins with a subject and a description only, no verb. The characters are run down and freezing, and their thoughts are not fluid and complete, but rather abruptly focused on the temperature. The fragment mimics the character's thought process. Okay, so this entry here is a great example of explaining how the author uses language to create a particular effect on the reader and to further the theme of the story. So we're not just going to simply take that first sentence and explain what it says all over again and say, the word cold is there to describe both Stella and the atmosphere that they're in. We're going to explain why that was such a good word choice, how it contributes to our understanding of the story and to the mood and all of that other stuff that was mentioned in the entry. You'll see that in just that first entry, I used 5 different literary terms. So this particular entry explores a lot of different aspects. There was a lot to unpack in this particular sentence. They're not all going to be this long. For instance, look at my second entry. But she was jealous of Magda. That doesn't, at a first glance, it doesn't seem like there's much to say about that particular sentence. But when you look at it again, and especially the sentences surrounding this one, my entry says here, the jealousy Stella feels toward baby Magda is reinforced by the use of Magda's name 4 times so close together. This name repeated creates a tone similar to a whiny teenager. The reader can almost hear Stella's thoughts, Magda, 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 Magda. Okay, so you may want to include in your quote the surrounding sentences or put some ellipses there, but what I noticed, that reminded me very much of Jan from the Brady Bunch, who's notoriously jealous of her older sister Marcia getting so much attention. Marcia, Marcia, Marcia. It says Magda over and over and over again, and that reinforces that jealousy that Magda feels. So here we're looking at a specific decision of the author's. The way that he chose to craft that line is to include Magda's name so many times, and that creates a particular effect, which is that reinforcement of the jealousy. The third entry, Stella wanted to be wrapped in a shawl, hidden away, asleep, rocked by the march, a baby, a round infant in arms. Early on in the story, the shawl emerges as a powerful symbol of protection and comfort. Stella yearns for the warmth and shelter that the shawl provides Magda. The shawl is more than just a blanket. It is a barrier against the outside world. It is a place to feel safe. The shawl, that's the title of our story, and we see it here mentioned, and the author goes to great lengths to explain the power that the shawl has early on, and we'll see that power continue to grow and develop as we read the story. Our next entry, and Rosa never stopped walking, a walking cradle. Here, the author uses a metaphor to describe Rosa. She is compared to a walking cradle. This emphasizes her role as a mother and reminds the reader of her huge responsibility. While most prisoners' only task is to survive, Rosa has to not only survive but also keep Magda alive as well, a nearly impossible task with a malnourished body that is failing her. This metaphor also dehumanizes her, just as the Nazis have done. She is no longer Rosa. Her only purpose is to provide for her child. As she marches endlessly through the camp, she is not a human being but a walking cradle, simply a vessel for her child. Lastly, this line repeats the word walking back to emphasize the endless march that Rosa and the other prisoners must endure. So again, this is a good journal entry because it's explaining the effect of the figurative language. I'm not simply stopping at Rosa is the walking cradle is a metaphor for Rosa. I know that already. That's only identifying the literary device. You have to go one step further and explain why that was such a poignant choice. Why is the metaphor of the walking cradle such an astute way of comparing Rosa? And the answer to that is listed in that entry. She's dehumanized, she's objectified, just like the Nazis have dehumanized her. Okay, her knees were tumors on sticks, her elbows, chicken bones. The author uses two metaphors to reinforce the idea that Stella is sickly. Because of the conditions of the concentration camp, she is undernourished, but rather than using a metaphor that simply compares Stella to something thin, she includes the imagery of tumors on sticks to express the idea of a sickness. Chicken bones also create a powerful image in the mind of the reader. Okay, again, we're identifying that they're metaphors and then going one step further to explain why that particular metaphor, that particular comparison is so effective and contributes to the meaning of the work as a whole. Okay, moving on to the second paragraph of the story. Again, I won't take the time to read this all to you. I'm hoping that you've already read the story by now and that you have the annotated copy in front of you. Here's a very good example of what I don't want you to do. Okay, I thought in addition to giving you good examples of journal entries, I want to give you a couple bad examples so that you can see the difference and know exactly what it is that I'm looking for. Okay, so looking at the line here, the face, very round, a pocket mirror of a face, but it was not Rosa's bleak complexion, dark like cholera. It was another kind of face altogether. Eyes blue as air, smooth feathers of hair, nearly as yellow as the star sewn into Rosa's coat. You could think she was one of their babies. This line is really tempting to comment on, and I do think you can comment on it in an effective way, but here is a way that is not effective. This is not a good entry. Here, the reader learns that Magda is possibly a product of rape. The author lets us know that she has Aryan features like blue eyes, light hair, and did not have Magda's, Rosa's, dark, sickly skin tone. She adds in one of their babies, indicating that it should be the guards or the Nazis' baby. Okay, why is this a bad entry? Simply because the explanation, the analysis, does not tell us anything that the quote didn't already tell us. It just explains the quote. It spells out for us that Magda is a product of rape. We already know that by what the quote tells us. Her blue eyes, her blonde hair, and her lighter skin complexion. It doesn't comment on the author's craft or style. It doesn't explain the effect of any literary devices. It doesn't focus on the how. It focuses on the what. And that's exactly what we should not be doing. Okay, so I didn't write out all the other ideas that I have for entries, but I've listed them here. All of these ideas, all of these quotes could be developed into very good journal entries. So, for instance, you could comment on the quote describing Rosa as already a floating angel. There's some strong imagery there that you can comment on and explain the effect of that imagery and how it contributes to the meaning of the work as a whole. Number 7, the shawl, a squirrel in a nest, safe. No one could reach her inside the little house of the shawl's windings. That's a metaphor. The squirrel nest and the little house, those are metaphors describing the shawl. You can also write a journal entry about how the symbol of that shawl is being repeated again. That symbol is actually turning into a motif because we see the shawl and its magic and its power coming up over and over again throughout the story. Another entry could focus on this quote here, as yellow as the star sewn into Rosa's coat. So they're comparing Magda's hair, which is yellow, to the star sewn onto Rosa's coat. That's an interesting simile. He's comparing those two things, but it's also ironic because the very thing that identifies Rosa as Jewish and an outcast and a victim is the same thing that identifies Magda as Aryan, the opposite, the the other and really the enemy. So yellow is working in two different ways for these two different people, and the author puts that sentence in there to make a point of that irony that exists there. Okay, so here's the next paragraph, paragraph 3. Here's an example of a bad entry and a good entry, and it's focused on the same quote. So we have Rosa, floating, dreamed of giving Magda away in one of the villages. Okay, so as a reader, that is definitely a line I know I want to analyze. I want to comment on the fact that this mother is dreaming of giving her child away. Here's the bad entry. Most mothers would never dream of giving away their child. However, Rosa feels like her child has a better chance of living if she were with a stranger. She thinks about stepping out of line and shoving Magda into the hands of any woman she could find, but she is afraid that the woman might not take the baby or might drop the baby. Again, that quote simply explains, the analysis rather simply explains the quote. It doesn't tell us anything that the quote does not. It's just explaining that Rosa wants to give the baby away. It doesn't analyze any author's choices. The better entry here on the bottom says it gives a little bit more as to why the author made particular decisions regarding this line. This line is shocking. It is not normal for a mother to dream of giving her child away. However, the author includes this in order to emphasize the desperation Rosa feels to protect her child. Okay, so the difference is that this entry explains the author's decision. Why put that line in the story? Because now we as the readers see just how desperate Rosa is to protect this child, that she's willing to go to extreme measures to get her child out of harm's way. There is a sense of impending death closing in on Rosa, and she dreams of being able to give Magda a chance at survival, knowing full well it would mean never seeing her again. Floating and dreamed are choices in diction that also contribute to her sadness and despair. Though these words usually have a positive connotation, in this case, the reader imagines Rosa in a hopeless fog. She is numb. A couple more entries for this particular paragraph. One mite of tooth tip sticking up in the bottom gum. How shining, an elfin tombstone of white marble gleaming there. The metaphor of Magda's, that should say tooth, being compared to a white marble tombstone foreshadows her tragic ending. Babies are not often associated with death, but the reader knows that in Magda's case, death is a real possibility. In addition, it reminds the reader of Magda's innocence and puts an exclamation point on the tragedy with which this story ends. This disturbing metaphor creates an uncomfortable and forlorn mood in the reader. In this story, death is always looming. So again, in this entry, we mentioned metaphor, foreshadowing, and mood. And we're talking specifically about the effect that this line has on the reader. Okay, also, and it's important to note that I'm reading this with the understanding that you have already read this story, hopefully 2, maybe even 3 or 4 times. So it's okay to mention things that happen at the end early on in your journal. It should be written in order in terms of how it's analyzing the quotes, how they kind of line up, but it's impossible not to talk about Magda's death early on because we want to talk about how this foreshadows her death. So you can mention things that happen later in the story, and in fact you should. Okay, moving on to the next one. The duct crevice extinct, a dead volcano, a blind eye, a chill hole. A string of metaphors describe Rosa's nipples. The metaphors are appropriate because when a volcano or an eye is functioning properly, they have a strong and important purpose. One usually thinks of a volcano as spewing hot lava, powerful and gushing, but instead it's dead. Similarly, as a young mother, Rosa's body should be able to provide for her child, but since she is deprived of any nutrients, her breasts are defunct. A blind eye is also an appropriate comparison in the same way. It is a part of the body that has a specific and important function, yet it is rendered useless if it is blind. Okay, the next paragraph here. Here's our first entry. She held her eyes open every minute, forgetting how to blink or nap, and Rosa and sometimes Stella studied their blueness. On the road, they raised one burden of a leg after another and studied Magda's face. Arian, Stella said, in a voice grown as thin as string. The blueness mentioned here emphasizes a sense of otherness about Magda. This contributes to Stella's jealousy. Why is she getting all the attention and love when she's one of them? When Stella utters the word Aryan, this is an outright rejection of Magda. Stella's voice is also described as grown, indicating a real anger and darkness in it. Later, the passage goes on to say that when Stella said this to Rosa, it is as if Stella said, "Let us devour her." Rosa's interpretation indicates to the reader that Stella's tone is hateful. Okay, so here are some more ideas for paragraph 4 in terms of entries. I didn't write these all out, but you could comment on the line that says it was a magic shawl, which contributes to furthering the symbol and its powerfulness. Again, if you feel like you already did that, accomplished that in your journal, which I feel like I did in one of my other entries, I talked about the shawl and the symbol of it, you may want to skip that line. Then we have Magda did not die, she stayed alive. This creates a sense of hope in the reader, which makes the ending all the more devastating when she does die. Moving on. Next couple paragraphs in the story, I only had one entry for those 2 paragraphs, and you're going to find that you may have one paragraph with 6 or 7 different things to say. You have a ton of entries and then maybe nothing in the next paragraph, or maybe 1 or 2 things. So here's another example of an entry. Rosa knew Magda was going to die very soon. And then later on in that same paragraph, Rosa knew that Magda was going to die very soon. Within just 6 lines of text, the author repeats this phrase twice. Because of this repetition, the reader feels a sense of impending doom. What's interesting, though, is that although the reader knows it's coming, Magda's death is still shocking. The reader expects it, yet the shock value is still great because of the brutality with which she is killed. These phrases do not soften the blow when the innocent baby is viciously murdered. Okay, moving on, next paragraph. Couple things to say here. Magda was quiet, but her eyes were horribly alive, like blue tigers. Okay, so the oxymoronic phrase horribly alive somehow makes sense, because although being alive is generally positive, in this case, being alive and suffering the daily torment of the concentration camps is a huge burden. Her eyes are described in this way to highlight her potential. Magda seems alert and generally happy because she is not old enough to realize the atrocities she endures. As a baby, she's a blank slate with an entire lifetime ahead of her, yet the reader knows this will not be the case for her, which adds to the tragedy. The simile, like blue tigers, also contributes to her vitality and energy that will be shortly snuffed out, extinguished. In addition, the author mentions the color of Magda's eyes again to remind the reader of her Aryan origins. If the eyes remind us that she's the product of a rape by a German guard, it seems fitting to compare the eyes to fierce tigers. Again, I don't want you to lose focus on what you're supposed to be doing. You're explaining why that simile is such an appropriate simile. What effect does it have? Don't just tell me that it's a simile. You're going to explain why it was such a good simile. In this case, it accomplishes so many things. It reminds us of her origins, and it tells us that she is one of them. Okay, 16. Still, Magda laughed at her shawl when the wind blew its corners, the bad wind with pieces of black in it that made Stella and Rosa's eyes tear. This imagery of Magda laughing at the wind blowing her shawl contributes to Magda's innocence. Magda's reaction to the wind is carefully juxtaposed with that of Stella and Rosa. The wind is probably piercing and cold, and Rosa and Stella are probably having a physical reaction to it. However, the tears in their eyes might be emotional as well. The piece of black may be ashes and actual remains of cremated Jews. Later in the story, Ozick describes the bitter, fatty, floating smoke that greased Rosa's skin. Rosa and Stella are aware of the facts of their situation. Magda's youthful ignorance protects her from this knowledge, which explains her misplaced delight. Okay, so here I kind of lumped together the rest of the story just for time's sake. So that for the next couple of paragraphs, I have just listed some ideas for entries rather than writing full entries for each of these. We have the quote, "Then Stella took the shawl away and made Magda die." That's a very interesting line. You could talk about the curt language, the abrupt diction. It jars the reader. It's shocking to us. Even though we know throughout the story it says over and over again, she's going to die, she's going to die. That language is shocking to us. "I was cold." Stella's quote, "I was cold." This is really the only line of dialogue in the whole story that we hear. And the double meaning in being physically cold and cold-hearted. The little pencil legs scribbling this way and that. In that quote, you might want to talk about the diction, how it's very childlike, and how the verb scribbling is used in a very different way than we usually imagine. And it's describing the way that she runs. You might describe the imagery of the pencil legs as well in that particular entry. The jolly light, that seems out of place. That adjective seems very out of place, jolly. But again, it contributes to Magda's naivety. Fearful joy is an oxymoron, which is very poignant because Rosa is both terrified that Magda will die and happy that she will no longer suffer the way that they do. So you can comment on that oxymoron. The word howling is an onomatopoeia. It's visceral, it's guttural, it's an animal sound. And that is appropriate for a number of reasons, but mostly because these people have been so dehumanized. So Rosa doesn't scream like a person would scream. It's described as a wolf's screech and howling. Those are all animal sounds because that's what they've been reduced to. Some more entries. Magda was wavering in the perilous sunlight of the arena, scribbling on such pitiful little bent shins. Okay, so here you could talk about that imagery. You could talk about the word choices of perilous used to describe the sunlight. Perilous means dangerous. Putting those two things together is very unique and interesting, and even oxymoronic if you think about it. The verb scribbling again. And then we have the consonants of the T sounds, so pitiful, little, bent, all those repeated T sounds, that's called consonants. The repetition of the word shawl in paragraph 13, it's said many, 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 many times over and over again. Why is it so important, particularly in that paragraph? You may want to discuss that. Here's another line that would be very good for an entry. "The sunset murmured of another life, of butterflies in summer." Just the beauty of this line, to me, is something worth mentioning. The imagery of the sunset, the word murmur is onomatopoeia, so it's almost like whispered promises. Another life may be a symbol for heaven. The butterflies, a symbol for her youth, innocence, freedom. The possibilities are really endless with that particular entry. The line, "The stink mixed with a bitter, fatty, floating smoke that greased Rosa's skin." I mentioned that in a previous entry, but this is really deserving of an entry all itself. The imagery, my God. This imagery is touch imagery, it's smell imagery, it's taste imagery, and it's sight imagery. How effective is that? This really allows the reader to imagine what that feels like, what that tastes like on their tongue, the word bitter, fatty. And this imagery is as effective as it is horrifying. Remember, all of that stuff floating through the air, that is the bodies being cremated in the ovens. And Rosa knows that. So this smoke that's floating around and greasing her skin is actually her peers, her counterparts that are being murdered in these ovens. And that imagery to me is just unbelievable and effective and, like I said, very, very horrifying. Some more ideas for entries for those last couple of paragraphs of the story. Far off, very far off, Magda leaned across her air-fed belly, reaching out with the rods of her arms. She was high up, elevated, riding someone's shoulder, but the shoulder that carried Magda was not coming toward Rosa and the shawl. It was drifting away. The speck of Magda was moving more and more into the smoky distance. This is a heartbreaking image of Magda being carried off over a guard's shoulder, and she's reaching out for her mother as she's carried away with the little rods of her arms. This type of image stays with the reader and makes the ending more powerful and tragic. Below the helmet, a black body, like a domino, and a pair of black boots hurled themselves in the direction of the electrified fence. This imagery of a black body and black boots implies like that of a demon or a devil. Usually the devil in literature, he's described as the black man or covered in soot. So we see this guard being compared to a devil through the powerful imagery there. In number 30, we have the imagery of the electric voices beginning to chatter wildly. Mama, mama, they all hum together. So the fence itself was chanting to Rosa. And then 31, she was no bigger than a moth. So this analogy comparing Magda to a moth is beautiful and poignant because it's describing her as white, which is a symbol for innocence, fluttering, going towards the light. Moths are drawn to light. And here we have Magda on the brink of her death as she's about to be thrown into this electric fence and brutally murdered. Okay, I want you to stop the video here or pause the video here and practice. I want you to try to write an entry for this line. The light was placid, mellow. On the other side of the steel fence, far away, there were green meadows speckled with dandelions and deep-colored violets beyond them. Even farther, innocent tiger lilies, tall, lifting their orange bonnets. So read through that line. Think about what you want to comment on. Is it going to be diction, imagery, any other type of figurative language that you're able to identify there? So pause the video and please write your practice entry now. Here's another line I'd like you to practice with. Sometimes the electricity in the fence would seem to hum. Even Stella said it was only an imagining, but Rosa heard real sounds in the wire, grainy, sad voices. The lamenting voices strummed so convincingly, so passionately, it was impossible to suspect them of being phantoms. Again, take a moment, please, pause the video, write a practice entry. Identify your figurative language, explain the effect it has on the story and the reader. Okay, just a couple more slides to go here. This is the last paragraph of the story, and I wanted to include a couple of full entries. And the moment Magda's feathered round head and her pencil legs and balloonish belly and zigzagged arms splashed against the fence. So here, the author uses surprising choices in diction. Words like feathered, balloonish, belly, zigzag, and splash are somewhat comedic. So that struck me as interesting. Why would the author choose such words to depict the gruesome death of a child? Those silly words like belly, instead of stomach, for example, emphasize Magda's youth and innocence and put an exclamation point on the tragedy. All of this simpleness and childlike wonder is being destroyed. It may also be to mimic the manner in which the murder is committed. The guards did not put much thought into disposing of the life of a child. To them, it was nothing more than squishing a bug under a shoe. This type of diction captures the casualness of the murderers. And this is the last entry. If she tried to pick up the sticks of Magda's body, they would shoot, and if she let the wolf's screech, ascending now through the ladder of her skeleton, break out, they would shoot. So she took Magda's shawl and filled her own mouth with it, stuffed it in and stuffed it in until she was swallowing up the wolf's screech and tasting the cinnamon and almond depth of Magda's saliva, and Rosa drank Magda's shawl until it dried. The reader is left with the heartbreaking image of a mother watching her child die. The metaphor for Magda's bones as sticks creates the image of this poor, malnourished child who never had a chance at life, who never saw a smile. It also creates an image of Magda desperately and fruitlessly collecting sticks in the aftermath. It makes Magda's lifeless body even more pitiful. A wolf's screech is a powerful sound image the reader can both hear and feel as they picture Rosa on her knees, full of pain, full of a pain too awful to bear. Further, the author artfully writes that this wolf screech rattles not her body but the ladder of her skeleton. Several times throughout the story, Rosa is described as disappearing, moving closer and closer to death. She's called a walking cradle, a floating angel, and is described as slowly turning into air. This is another metaphor to describe that which is scarcely a body. Lastly, as Rosa shoves the shawl into her mouth to drown out her screams, we see the shawl dry up and, in a sense, lose its magic. It kept Magda alive, and after Stella takes it from her, she immediately dies. To have the shawl dry up is to signify the end of this magic symbol. Okay, so this particular story, I was able to come up with so many entries for. You're going to find, I'm not expecting you to have 40 entries per story, but you are going to find that you have a lot more to say about some stories than others. You have to keep in mind your time constraints and really go from there. Okay, so please use this presentation as a model. Look at the PDF, take the time to print this out, look at it as a PDF so you can read through it in your own time without having to watch the whole video over and over again. But this is what I'm expecting you to do in your journals. Okay? Any questions, please make sure that you ask them to me via email or in person, whatever is easiest for you. Thanks for watching.